It's a new day on Deep Space Nine, and Worf is sparring with Dax in a holosuite. The excuse is a disagreement over whether Worf's fancy stabber is better than Dax's traditional stabber, but the real reason is for them to have a bit of a flirt. Odo acts as the in-ship butt in this instance, calling Worf to tell him that a drunk Klingon wants to see him specifically. The reason is because Kurn here is Worf's brother, and he's come to ask Worf to murderize him. Worf lets him sleep off the booze, but a sober Kurn still feels the same way. Understandable, really. Worf's decision to tell Gowron to go do one at the start of the season meant the entire House of MOGH became forfeit. Kurn lost his seat on the council, and all family estates and property were seized. That makes him persona non grata to all Klingons, and the only way to regain his honor is for somebody to make him do a dead. We'll leave Worf to sort that one out and move to O'Brien and Kira in a mega shuttle. They're on the way home after an undisclosed trip when they witness a bright flash as they're about to enter Bajoran space. Kira thinks the relevant science bollocks suggests it was a cloaked ship kabooming, so they go for a look. Except, no they don't. A Klingon bird of prey appears in front of them as they approach the detonation site and tells them to sod off because they're engaging in some training. They've got bigger weapons than us, so Kira thinks it's time to leave, though they get as much data as possible about the mystery kaboom on the way out. Back on the station, Dax is looking for Worf in Quark's bar. He says he saw Worf earlier when he came in to buy a particular Klingon incense, and got very upset when Quark tried to pass him off with some replicated stuff instead of the real thing. That gets Dax curious, and she checks with Odo about the guy who wanted to see Worf when they were sparring before. She puts it all together when she learns it was Worf's brother, and after checking the computer to confirm they're both together, rushes to his quarters. She and Odo arrive just after the dagger gets buried in Kurn. This is the future, though, so a little bit of stabbing doesn't mean it's all over. Off Dax and Kurn teleport to the infirmary, while Worf gets told by Odo that he'll be facing a murder charge if he dies. Kurn's going to be alright, according to Dax, but Sisko is understandably a bit miffed about the whole situation. He's also lumping Dax in with it, her having previously engaged in a Klingon murder sabbatical herself back in Season 2. The line, it seems, is when it involves people doing a dead on his own station, and he makes it clear he won't tolerate Worf having another go. Dax steps in to assure Sisko that they can find another option, then bundles Worf out of the office with her. To the side plot once more, and Sisko wants to know what Kira and O'Brien think they've found. In short, dunno mate, could have been something cloaked, but we're not sure. Kira's a touch concerned with how close to Bajor it happened, so Sisko sends them to have a poke in the Defiant. That old military exercise excuse cuts both ways. Down to the infirmary we go, and Kurn is understandably confused about still being alive. Confusion gives way to anger when he finds out what happened and that Worf didn't stop the interference, but Kurn is resigned to whatever happens being out of his hands. It's a situation Worf doesn't really have an answer for, so it's just as well that Dax visits his quarters to apologize for interfering. She thinks Kurn could stay here. That way there'd be at least one familiar face, even if it is the one who took a massive shit all over Kurn's life. He'll need a job to keep him busy, and preferably one unrelated to Starfleet, given how he feels about what it's done to Worf, so we end up in Odo's office. Having a Klingon on staff might be useful in a brawl, but he's concerned about how many MOGH spots would be occupied afterwards. Worf is convinced Kurn can be persuaded to pull his punches, and Odo agrees. Odo's surprised to learn he's pretty good at the job, Kurn being fastidious during a cargo inspection. A chat with Worf even seems to indicate that Kurn has made peace with his situation, though Worf doesn't look entirely convinced. Let's check on that side plot once more. The Defiant is poking around the border of Bajoran space where we saw the kaboom, and there are science wibblies to indicate activity of cloaked ships, like the one that just appeared after another explosion, and with significant damage. A call to provide help is initially rejected, but when it becomes clear any other cloaked ships aren't going to lend them a hand, they call back and ask for medical assistance. The Defiant doesn't have facilities big enough, so they accept our offer to tow them back to DS9 and use the infirmary. That's assuming we have any space left. Odo calls Worf and tells him his brother is back there again, and he's been quite badly wounded. Kurn will be fine, Bashir having sorted it once more, but the method of his being injured is a concern. That cargo inspection took a turn for the worse when he found some smuggled goods and the captain took a shot at him. The thing is, Kern could have taken the guy easily, which means he allowed it to happen. That makes him a liability for any security group, so he's now officially unemployed again. When Worf tries to find out what he's playing at, Kern just shuts him down. Worf's the older brother, so by Klingon custom, he should be telling Kern what to do and he'll do it. All this talking is so human. Let's leave that there and move back to the side plot. The Klingon ship is docked at DS9 and we're treating the injuries, partly so that Bashir can see what caused the kaboom. His best bet is a firework, but your average bang-bang can't track a cloaked ship, and there were no trails to indicate something moving. It's Worf who suggests the kaboom was caused by a mine rather than a firework, and a cloaked one at that. This leads them to conclude that the Klingons are setting minefields around Bajoran space with the intention to turn them on if things get angry, and this kaboom must have been a malfunction or possibly a fuck-up when setting it. That's a significant escalation if it's true, and bloody dangerous to boot. The only way to find out if they're real, and where they're planted if so, is to get the data from the Klingon ship we towed back here. Luckily, Worf has an idea. Kern's not sold on the plan when Worf tells him they'll pretend to be crew members to get on board and nick the data. He thinks it's dishonourable to betray his own kind. Okay, he also thinks Gowron's wrong and this whole thing could blow up in their faces, and that a war with the Federation won't be as easy to win as the Council seems to believe, but it's not his place to complain. Worf instead argues that not helping to save the Empire from the foolishness of its leaders would be the more dishonourable of the two options, and off to the infirmary they go once more. At least it's not to bring Kern back from the dead this time. Bashir's giving them some injuries and fiddling their DNA so it'll match two lads currently lying on infirmary beds. That's so they can get through doors once they've been teleported aboard the Klingon ship. It goes south when they're discovered by an officer and Worf tries to bluff his way out of it. He thinks it's working, but Kern sees things differently and poops green at the lad, then shows Worf the dagger that was about to kill him. Worf goes back to nicking the data we need before anybody else turns up, while Kern bemoans that he's now sunk so low as to kill one of his own kind. We got what we need though, and Sisko's chuffed about the whole thing, sending Kira back out again in the Defiant. When it's just Worf and Dax left alone in the room, he admits he's bothered by what just happened. Not the guy doing it dead, but the fact that he didn't see it coming when his brother did. It's enough to make him realize that he wouldn't fit into Klingon society, even if he somehow managed to restore his house, and Kern's position is even shittier. He's got nothing left, and Worf can't even make him do it dead. That gives Dax an idea. The Defiant has arrived at its destination. Kira sends out a call to let any invisible ships in the area know we're about to blow up their minefield, though she doesn't receive a response. The first kaboom doesn't get a rise either, but detonating a load more causes a couple of ships to show up and decide that perhaps buggering off would be smart. With the side plot wrapped up, we address the problem of Kern. He's in Worf's quarters getting wankered and playing with a pistol. Worf takes it off him and the two lament not having been brought up together before Kern has a nap. This nap involves him now being on a table in the infirmary, that booze he was drinking perhaps having had a little something added to it. Bashir asks Worf if he's sure about wiping Kern's memory and changing his DNA, but it's all been arranged. A guy that Worf and Kern's dad knew will come to take care of him, essentially giving him a clean slate to start over. Kern won't remember anything about his identity, and a new face will make sure that nobody else does either. The man who was Kern wakes to find somebody saying he's been in an accident that destroyed his memory, and his name is Rodek. It'll be fine though, as the guy is his dad and can explain everything he's forgotten. He sees Worf on the way out and asks if they're related, only to be told Worf has no family, so we'll leave Rodek to learn everything anew until the next adventure. What constitutes murder? At what point do we say a life has ended? At what point does a unique individual cease to exist? It's a more difficult question than it sounds on the surface. We've already asked ourselves in the show if Jadzia Dax is culpable for the crimes, true or false, of Curzon Dax. Sisko did a fair job of convincing us that she is not the same individual, despite carrying the memories of prior hosts. Well, some of them, depending on what the hosts want to share at any given time, but that's a whole other question. The point is, we argued that Jadzia is not Curzon, because a component part underwent a fundamental change, and that's an argument I'm inclined to agree with. Kern, too, undergoes his own fundamental change in this episode, but in reverse. The memories and experiences, all that made Kern, ceased to exist, and the blank slate of Rodek came into being. Kern, for all intents and purposes, is gone. So, did Worf commit murder, and was Starfleet his accomplice? I got curious enough to go and look at the legal definition of murder under UK law for shits and giggles. This event seems to cover most of the basics. It's premeditated, for example. Those involved actively wanted to cause the cessation of Kern and knew that's what would happen. It's caused by those of sound mind, at least in the case of Dax and Bashir. You could argue Worf's state of mind, I guess, but that's a whole other debate about what's considered sound for a Klingon. The only place a charge of murder might fall down is in the definition of kill, and that opens up a whole different wrinkle. In the UK, there's no legal definition of what constitutes death. The commonly held position, based on a case that went to the House of Lords and determined by clinical diagnosis, is that the threshold for death is the end of brainstem activity. That's clearly not the case here, as Rodek is alive and well, but it creates a curious situation where Worf and company might become culpable for the murder of Kern at some point in the future when Rodek dies. It's the brainstem Kern used, after all, even if he wasn't in it at the time it ceased to work. Of course, that's all based on current legislation in one poxy little country, on one insignificant island, on one unremarkable ball of rock in space, and I think it's fair to assume that things will have changed over the course of nearly 400 years and the introduction of hundreds of alien species. Defining death as the end of brainstem activity clearly isn't going to work for species with no brainstem. The question remains the same, though. Did we murder Kern? Personally, I'm of the inclination to say yes. As far as I'm concerned, DS9 has already made its feelings on that one known through the Dax argument. To pluck a completely random potential future out of the air, let's say that Jadzia Dax dies and the Dax symbiont lives on in someone else. We'll call them Schmesri. If that were to happen, then we wouldn't say the person responsible for the end of Jadzia Dax wasn't a murderer purely because Schmesri Dax is still around, and that theoretical person would have a lot more of Jadzia's memories than Rodek does of Kern. If all of this sounds familiar, it's because we're firmly in Tuvik's country again, and I'd imagine your reaction to this one was pretty close to how you felt when Catherine Janeway did her first murder. A little reading tells me the reception to this one was varied when it was first broadcast, with much of it being levelled at Bashir just straight up erasing a guy. The counterpoint to that seems to be that he was following Klingon culture after having it explained to him by Worf, but I don't find that to be a compelling argument after Sisko specifically called out people placing cultural acceptance before their oath to uphold Federation law. Only a few episodes ago we had Eggnog saying that even cadets are expected to report any legal infractions, so arguing that Bashir would say, "Oh, go on then, we'll do just one brain erase as a treat," frankly strikes me as complete bollocks. All of which doesn't even take into account that Kern himself did not consent to the procedure. Maybe it's what he would have wanted, considering it close enough to count, or maybe he'd have thought it was a dishonourable cop-out. We don't know. He wasn't asked. That fact alone makes it a distinctly unethical performance on Bashir's part. Perhaps he'd argue that somebody who wants to engage in the MOGH ritual isn't of sufficiently sound mind to provide consent, but that argument directly contradicts the idea that Bashir's doing this to honour Klingon culture. You can't disagree with the premise, then perform it in your own way and still call it inclusion. The logic doesn't work. Ultimately, the death of Kern is open to being interpreted based on what you consider a person to be. It's a topic we've covered here before in relation to the Doctor on Voyager, my own opinion being that life is the consciousness rather than whatever shell carries it. If you're willing to accept that the Doctor is a person, regardless of how that personality is housed, then you probably just watched a murder. If, however, you think the machinery that holds the EMH matters more, then perhaps your view is that Kern merely underwent a factory reset. Let's leave it there and touch on something else in the episode before we end. When Sisko has a pop at Worf for using his brother's tits as a knife rack, he associates Dax with the whole thing. On the surface, that's a little unfair. Okay, she's engaged in Klingon stabby times herself previously, but in this case she actually prevented the whole thing from being much worse. Sisko doesn't generally do things for no reason though, so might there be another purpose behind it? Worf's not integrated yet, still very much the odd man out in a group that's worked together now for years. Throwing the book at him for this, after he basically gave up his option to return home by standing up to Gowron, would be a pretty shit way of repaying his oath to Starfleet. It also raises a potential complaint of being okay with Dax going off and doing Klingon bollocks, but acting like a dick when an actual Klingon tries to do it. By tarring Dax with the same brush here, he's deftly sidestepped singling Worf out and potentially further isolating him from the others, whilst also giving him an ally and covering his own arse for prior allowances. More than that, I think Dax knew what he was trying to do as well. If she genuinely felt aggrieved by his actions, I think she'd have stood up to it. Even without considering that she's onto her second lifetime of friendship with Sisko, something that would give her significant insight into his actions, she's learned the value of standing up to people in a previous episode. It was a main plot point during the ritual where she met former hosts, confronting Kurzodo when he became a dick being what resolved the entire story. Maybe I'm pulling ideas out of my arse again, or being overly generous of Sisko, but the fact that it gave Worf somebody he could turn to strikes me as very convenient indeed. If we're being even more generous, maybe Sisko had seen hints of something else starting here too, and thought he was giving an old friend a hand. End of episode.
Come on then, you're the smart one. Are we getting out?
Occult magic.
What did you call me?
I said occult.
Yeah, no, I'm just trying to make these entertaining.
Sigh. Anyway, we're out of options for science, so the only way we're going to get back is through the obscure mysteries of the supernatural.
That's a bit of an hard turn for a science fiction show, isn't it?
You mean the show where somebody shagged a ghost?
Fair point. Are we gonna do this magic then?
Well, I can draw things with the chalk.
Speaking of which, where did you get the chalk from?
Some questions are best left unanswered.
Oh, bum stuff.
You're going to get this video demonetized.
Hey, don't pay us anyway, dick.
As I was saying, I can use the chalk to draw pentagrams and symbols and so on, then we do incantations.
And I'd imagine you just happen to know all of this due to your often questionable but occasionally very handy cultural database. You know, what with you previously being computer of a starship and all.
You are entirely correct about the plausible and logical explanation for my apparent wealth of knowledge on this topic.
Sounds reasonable to me. Come on then, Paul Daniels, let's get on with it. Woof.